The night settled over the camp with a silence so complete that even the smallest sound seemed out of place, from the distant shift of a guard's boots on gravel to the faint hum of the searchlight sweeping slowly across the fence. And somewhere within that controlled stillness, one prisoner lay awake, not watching the darkness, but measuring it. For days he had studied the rhythm of the place, counting the seconds between patrols, tracking the movement of light along the wire, memorizing the exact moment when the camp stopped looking outward and turned inward, just long enough for something to slip through unnoticed. And when that moment finally came, he did not hesitate, because everything he needed to know had already been decided long before he left his bed. The camp moved with a rhythm so consistent that it no longer felt like a place guarded by men, but like a system governed by repetition, where every patrol followed the same path, every beam of light traced the same arc across the ground, and every hour closed upon itself in a pattern that rarely shifted, creating an order that could be trusted precisely because it did not change. From the outside, that order was meant to control, to contain, and to eliminate uncertainty, but from within, it offered something else entirely, because once a pattern is seen often enough, it stops being a barrier and begins to reveal its edges, and those edges, however small, are where possibility begins. He did not start with a plan, but with stillness, lying awake when the others slept, listening to the distant movement of guards beyond the barracks walls, the faint crunch of gravel under steady boots, the quiet hum of electricity feeding the searchlights that swept slowly across the perimeter. And over time, those sounds stopped being background noise and became markers, signals that could be measured and placed in sequence. He began to count without moving his lips, tracking the interval between each pass of the nearest guard, noticing how the footsteps faded, returned, and faded again, always in the same order, always separated by the same length of silence, until the unpredictability he had once assumed simply disappeared. The light from the tower followed a similar logic, not random, but mechanical in its movement, pausing just long enough at the far end of its reach before sliding back across the fence line, leaving behind a momentary darkness that felt insignificant at first, but became more defined the longer he watched it. It was in that darkness that the idea began to take shape, not as a complete plan, but as a question, because if the light moved away at the same moment the guard turned, then for a brief interval, no one was looking directly at that section of the fence, and that interval, though short, was real. During the day, the place he had noticed looked ordinary, a stretch of wire no different from the rest, but the ground beneath it told a quieter story, dipping slightly where the soil had shifted over time, creating a shallow depression that was barely visible unless you knew where to look, and even then, it seemed too small to matter. At night, however, the same place changed, not physically, but in how it was seen, because when the light moved away and the shadow deepened, the gap beneath the wire became something else entirely, a narrow opening defined not by size, but by timing. He returned to that spot more than once, never approaching it directly, but passing near enough to confirm what he had begun to understand, watching how the darkness formed and dissolved, how the guard's path intersected with the light's movement, and how the two never quite overlapped in the way one might expect. Nothing about the camp was careless, but it was predictable, and predictability, once understood, created a kind of space that did not exist for those who simply followed the rules without question. He told no one, not because he doubted the others, but because the plan depended on precision, and precision could not survive uncertainty, especially in a place where even a single misplaced word could travel farther than intended. Outwardly, he remained the same, moving when ordered, standing in line without hesitation, returning to the barracks at the appointed hour, never drawing attention to himself, because invisibility inside the system was the only way to step outside of it. By the time the night arrived when he chose to act, nothing around him had changed. The guards still walked, The lights still moved. The camp still held its shape. But the difference was no longer in the place itself, but in how completely he understood it. And that understanding, built from repetition, silence, and time, was the only advantage he needed. Many people who enjoy these stories watch on television. Subscribing helps make sure the next story appears automatically. When the camp finally settled into the depth of night, the familiar sounds that had once blended into a single background murmur separated themselves into distinct layers. The distant steps of a sentry moving along gravel, the soft creak of timber contracting in the cold air, the low electrical hum feeding the searchlights, and beneath all of it, the kind of silence that only appears in places where every movement is regulated and every hour is expected to resemble the one before it. He waited until that silence reached the exact shape he had been listening for over several nights, because the moment he needed was not defined by darkness alone, but by the arrangement of everything within it: the light turning away from the fence, the guard moving beyond the angle of direct sight, and the yard itself falling briefly into a pattern that opened rather than closed. Leaving the barracks required less movement than courage, because the act itself was simple: a careful step away from the bunk, a pause near the wall, a hand against the wood to steady his balance, and then a slow passage through the dark interior where the sleeping forms of the other prisoners remained still beneath their blankets, unaware that one of them was already moving toward the edge of the camp. Outside, the air felt colder than it had during the day, carrying the smell of damp earth and pine from beyond the fence, and for a moment that smell alone was enough to sharpen everything around him, because it belonged to the outside world and reminded him that what he was attempting was no longer theoretical. He did not move quickly, since speed would only break the rhythm he had spent so long studying, and instead crossed the yard with the same deliberate patience that had shaped the plan itself, keeping close to the shadowed sides of the buildings where the walls broke his outline and reduced the chance that a sudden turn of light might catch him in open ground. The searchlight from the nearest tower moved as he expected, sweeping across the fence line with mechanical certainty before sliding toward the far side of the perimeter, and in the brief darkness left behind, the section of wire he had chosen seemed to sink into the earth, becoming less a barrier than a shape hidden inside the night. Even then he did not approach it immediately, because the danger was greatest in the final steps, where impatience could undo what observation had made possible. So he stopped once more, listening for the sentry whose boots he knew would return in another direction before the light completed its next sweep. Only when the timing matched the pattern fixed in his mind did he lower himself and close the remaining distance to the fence. The ground beneath the wire was rougher than he remembered, packed hard in some places and loose in others, and as he crouched beside it, he could see that the dip in the earth was real but unforgiving, offering just enough space to attempt passage and no room at all for error. For an instant the gap looked too small, not because it had changed, but because standing before it transformed an idea into a physical fact, and physical facts are harder to ignore than plans made in darkness. He placed one hand against the soil, lowered his shoulder, and began to guide himself forward with the kind of controlled pressure that demanded attention to every inch of movement, careful not to shift the wire, careful not to let fabric catch, careful not to create the one metallic sound that would travel farther in the still night than any shout. The earth pressed against his clothes, and the wire hovered so close above him that he could feel its presence even when it did not touch him. And in those few slow seconds beneath the fence, time lost its ordinary measure and became nothing more than tension, breath, and the fear that a single careless motion would freeze the entire night around him. When he reached the other side, he did not rise at once, but lay still against the cold ground, listening with complete concentration for any reaction from the camp, any change in the sound of the guards, any signal that the fence had betrayed him. Nothing changed. The boots continued at their distance, The light moved on its usual path, and the camp, for one more moment, remained unaware that one of its prisoners was no longer inside it. He pushed himself forward only after that silence confirmed itself, moving away from the perimeter with measured steps as the fence receded behind him. And though he had imagined that crossing it would feel like release, what came instead was something sharper and less comforting. The sudden understanding that freedom, once reached, was no longer an idea to move toward, but a condition he would now have to survive. Beyond the fence, the land widened in a way that felt almost deliberate, as if the absence of boundaries itself carried a weight he had not anticipated, because inside the camp every step had been defined by limits, while here the distance in every direction seemed to extend without instruction, offering space without guidance. He continued forward along the line he had chosen in the dark, keeping close to the edges of fields where low fences and scattered trees interrupted the openness just enough to give him a sense of direction, even though those landmarks meant nothing beyond their immediate usefulness. And each time he adjusted his path, it was based not on knowledge, but on the need to remain unseen. The ground shifted beneath his steps as he moved, dry grass giving way to firmer soil, then back again, the texture changing in subtle ways that required attention, because without the structure of the camp, even the simplest movement demanded more awareness than before, and every sound carried farther in the quiet countryside than it ever had behind the fences. For a while, the rhythm of his movement replaced the rhythm he had studied inside the camp, steady and controlled, guided by the same discipline that had allowed him to plan the escape, yet lacking the certainty that had made that plan possible in the first place. The horizon began to change slowly, not all at once, but in a gradual shift of light that turned darkness into shape, revealing outlines that had been hidden before, the distant form of a barn, the straight line of a road cutting through the land, the faint geometry of fields arranged with a precision that suggested order, but not familiarity. With that light came clarity, and with clarity came something he had not accounted for, because the farther he moved from the camp, the more visible he became, and the more visible he became, the less control he had over what might happen next. The road, which had been only a darker line in the distance during the night, now stood clearly against the fields, offering a direct path that might have made travel easier, yet also exposing him to anyone who might be using it, and the decision to avoid it forced him to remain in the open land, where cover was uncertain and direction remained unclear. He slowed slightly, not out of fatigue, but because the movement that had felt purposeful in the dark now required reconsideration, and for the first time since crossing the fence, he began to recognize that leaving the camp had not solved the problem he thought it would, but had instead replaced one kind of certainty with another kind of risk. There were no signs pointing him forward, no indication of where safety might exist, and no one waiting to guide him. And as the morning continued to unfold, the idea of distance itself began to change, no longer something to increase without question, but something that needed meaning in order to matter. He paused briefly near the edge of a field, not long enough to rest, but long enough to look across the land with a different understanding than he had carried through the night, because what had once seemed like freedom now appeared as an unknown space that offered no immediate answers. The camp behind him had been a place he could measure, observe, and predict, while the world ahead resisted all of those things. And in that contrast, the advantage he had built for himself began to dissolve, replaced by a realization that escaping the fence had only been the first decision, not the final one. By the time the sun rose high enough to erase the last traces of night, the landscape around him had fully revealed itself, and with that clarity came a shift that could not be ignored, because the same open land that had allowed him to move unseen now offered no protection at all, only distance measured in exposure rather than safety. The fields stretched outward in long, uninterrupted lines, broken only by fences and occasional farm buildings that stood too far apart to provide immediate cover. And as he continued walking along their edges, he became aware that every movement now existed within a space that could be seen from multiple directions at once, a condition that had not existed inside the camp. He kept away from the road, even though it offered the most direct path through the land, because its visibility made it dangerous, and instead followed the boundaries between fields where the ground was uneven and the direction less certain, choosing concealment over speed even as that choice made his progress slower and less defined. The air had warmed slightly, carrying the distant sounds of morning activity, a vehicle somewhere beyond the horizon, the faint call of someone working the land, and those sounds, though far away, reminded him that this place was not empty, only spread out in a way that made its presence harder to locate. He slowed again, not because he lacked the strength to continue, but because continuing without direction began to feel less like escape and more like movement without purpose. And that distinction, subtle at first, grew clearer with every step that led him farther into a place he did not understand. Inside the camp, every decision had been shaped by observation, every movement aligned with a pattern he could predict, but here there was no pattern to follow, no system to read, only the need to choose a direction without knowing what waited at its end. The plan that had carried him to the fence no longer existed, because it had never extended beyond that point, and now, standing within a landscape that offered neither guidance nor certainty, he understood that the part of the escape he had prepared for was already behind him, while the part that mattered most had only just begun. He stopped completely for the first time since leaving the camp, allowing the silence around him to settle without interruption, and in that stillness, the distance he had created no longer felt like progress, but like separation from something he had at least been able to understand. The camp had been a place of restriction, but it had also been a place of structure, where food arrived at set hours, where movement followed known paths, and where even confinement existed within boundaries that made sense once they were studied closely enough. Out here, there were no such boundaries, only the possibility of being seen, of being stopped, or of continuing indefinitely without reaching anything that could sustain him. And as those possibilities aligned in his mind, the decision he had avoided began to take form without urgency, but with increasing clarity. He turned his head once more toward the direction he had come from, not because he expected to see the camp from that distance, but because he could still measure it, still imagine its layout, still understand its rhythm in a way that the open land refused to offer. What had seemed like freedom during the night now appeared as a condition that required more than movement. It required knowledge, support, and a destination, none of which he possessed, and in that realization, the advantage he had gained by escaping began to lose its meaning. Without any sudden gesture or visible hesitation, he shifted his direction, turning back along the path he had taken, not as an act of surrender, but as a choice shaped by the quiet understanding that continuing forward would not lead him where he needed to go, while returning, however unexpected, would at least bring him back to something he could navigate. By the time he began retracing his steps, the land no longer felt like an opportunity waiting to be used, but like a distance that had already revealed its limits. And as he moved back across the same fields he had crossed only hours earlier, the direction he followed carried a clarity that had been missing before, because for the first time since leaving the camp, he was no longer choosing between unknown paths, but returning along one he already understood. The morning had advanced, and with it the activity of the countryside had grown more distinct, the distant sound of machinery now clearer, the occasional movement along the far road easier to detect, and although none of it came close to him, it was enough to reinforce the awareness that this place, however open it appeared, was not empty, and that remaining within it without purpose would only increase the risk he had already taken. He adjusted his pace as he approached the outer edge of the area surrounding the camp, slowing not out of caution alone, but because the transition between open land and controlled space required a different kind of awareness, one that depended less on avoiding patterns and more on entering them at the right moment. The fence did not appear all at once, but gradually, first as a faint line interrupting the horizon, then as a structure that became more defined with each step, until the familiar outline of wire and posts stood clearly in front of him, exactly as he had left it, unchanged, still following the same rhythm he had studied before. For a brief moment, he remained at a distance, observing once again the movement of the guards and the sweep of the lights, not because he needed to confirm what he already knew, but because returning required the same precision as leaving, and even now, a careless approach could turn the act of return into something far more complicated than it needed to be. He did not attempt to hide his presence completely, because the intention behind his movement had changed, and instead of searching for the narrow gap beneath the wire, he approached in a way that allowed himself to be seen at the right moment, choosing visibility over concealment as he closed the final distance. It did not take long for a guard to notice him. The reaction immediate but measured, a call issued, a second figure turning, the structure of the camp reasserting itself in a sequence of actions that followed clear procedure rather than confusion. Within minutes, he stood once again at the perimeter, no longer outside it, but not yet fully returned, positioned in that brief space where intention had to be understood before it could be acted upon. The guards spoke to him, their voices controlled, their questions direct, and although the situation did not fit the usual pattern of escape and capture, it did not disrupt the order of the camp, because even something unexpected could be absorbed into a system that relied on structure rather than reaction. He offered no resistance, no explanation beyond what was necessary, and allowed himself to be guided back through the same boundary he had crossed before, this time not as someone escaping it, but as someone re-entering it by choice. Inside, nothing had changed. The barracks stood in their same positions, the paths remained the same, and the routine continued without interruption. Yet for him, the place was no longer what it had been when he first planned to leave it, because it was now defined not only by its limits, but by the comparison to what lay beyond them. As he was led back across the yard, the distance he had created during the night seemed to collapse into something much smaller, not because it had been insignificant, but because its meaning had changed, and what remained was not the escape itself, but the decision that followed it, a decision that no one inside the camp would fully understand, yet one that required no explanation to exist. By the time he returned to the barracks, the camp had already resumed its routine, the guards moving along their usual paths, the prisoners gathering for the day's work, and the quiet structure of the place continuing as if nothing had happened. Yet for those who later heard the story, it was not the escape that remained difficult to understand, but the choice to come back. In a world defined by movement, survival, and the constant search for advantage, his brief journey beyond the fence revealed something far less visible than distance, because what he encountered outside was not simply freedom, but the absence of everything that had once given his decisions direction, and without that direction, the idea of escape lost its certainty. The camp still held him, still defined the limits of his movement, yet it also offered something the open land did not, a structure that could be read, predicted, and lived within, and in that contrast, captivity became something more complex than confinement alone. For the others, the story would pass from one conversation to another, repeated in fragments, questioned, doubted, and remembered, not as an example of failure, but as a moment when the meaning of freedom shifted quietly and without explanation in the space between the fence and the land beyond it. Thank you for spending this time here. If these quiet, true World War II stories matter to you, subscribing helps this channel continue.